fertility specialist stationed at the Princeton Research Station, and to talk a little bit about some production agronomy pertaining to fertility timing and planning. We're seeing a return to interest in purchasing planters and planter equipment with liquid or fertilizer.
Clint, I might have shared my screen too soon. If I did, I apologize. Did I cut you off?
Edwin, are you with us?
I am.
No, we're ready for you.
Okay, I need to shop. Let me share the other screen. Give me just a second. I'm trying to get there. Huh. Clint, I'm having technical difficulties. It worked earlier.
Well, it was up just a second ago, but now it's gone back.
Well,
there it is.
Is that the right screen?
Fertilizer placement.
Yeah, but you're seeing my preview screen, aren't you?
Yeah, but if you can advance from that, we'll just keep going.
Let me try this. How about that?
That's larger. That looks good.
That's what we're trying for. And I'm going to move this over here. Okay. Well, thank you, Clint. I'll try to be on time today. So you asked me to talk about starter fertilizers, and I kind of thought the first part of this presentation, I'd just talk a little bit about fertilizer placement, which comes into play when we're talking about starter fertilizers or pop-up fertilizers. So one of the first things you need to consider when talking about nutrient placement is, one, what is the nutrient you're looking at? What's the nutrient of interest? What crop are you looking at? What are your soil test levels? What are the environmental conditions present? And what would be the benefits or challenges to different placement options? And this comes into place whether you're looking at a starter or just band application of a nutrient. So the nutrient of interest, it depends on the specific nutrient. Different ones behave differently. If you broadcast, we're covering a large soil volume, and typically we think that's going to be the most benefit for your mobile nutrients, those supplied by mass flow, those nutrients that move with the water. Nitrate and sulfate are, the two best examples of nutrients that move by mass flow. If the water is moving from the soil to the plant, those nutrients are contained in that water and getting into the plant that way. And when you make a broadcast application, that raises the nutrient status of the entire soil area. Excuse me. Banding, now we're concentrating the nutrient application in a very limited amount of soil, and where that would most likely be beneficial is for immobile nutrients, and those are the ones that we're typically supplying by diffusion or root interception. And pretty much everything but nitrogen and sulfate come to mind, but the big ones, phosphorus, potassium, zinc, those are the ones that we're actually working against a concentration gradient to get into the plant. And that raises that nutrient status in that area, which raises the nutrient status of, or the concentration gradient. So we have a concentration gradient if we're thinking about things flowing from a high concentration to a low concentration, water running downhill. That's the same thing we're trying to do with a band. We're trying to raise that gradient closer to the plant so we might not have to apply as much. We can be more efficient with that fertilizer when we apply it in that method. The next thing we need to think about is the crop of interest. So salt tolerance is one thing when you think about a band application. or a starter application, whether 2x2 or in furrow or pop-up. So soybean is actually more tolerant to salt than corn most of the time. However, we think typically of corn being the crop that receives the starter. And there's some reasons for that, but typically our row spacing is tighter with soybeans, so 15 or 20 inches versus 30-inch corn. A lot more still if you're talking about a 2x2 for soybean. And then our planting dates. Typically, we're going to plant our corn quite a bit earlier in Kentucky than we do our soybean. Some people start maybe late March, but April is, the typical starting date for these better well-drained soils, whereas we push it back for soybean. And all this is going to come into play when we get into banding or starter fertilizer. So soil test levels, how does that influence our decision to band or not to band? Well, when we have medium or high soil test levels, our soil fixation potential is relatively low. If you think about adding fertilizer, the first hog at the fertilizer trough is the soil chemistry. So the lower that soil test value is, the more the more fertilizer that soil will potentially fix. So that when we're in that medium or high range, anything we apply, and we might have more than adequate enough if we're in the high range, but that fertilizer applied is available for the plant to utilize. When we get down to our low soil test values, our soil fixation potential is higher. So the first fertilizer that we're going to apply is probably going to go to that soil chemistry, and then the plant uses it. This is an example I just pulled off of the internet yesterday. I thought about it. I said, Champagne waterfall, that might be a good analogy for talking about soil fixation. We pour that first bottle in at the top and it'll fill up that first glass, and then it overflows and fills up the next ones, and then it overflows and fills up the next one. So we're not filling up those next, that fertilizer is not available till we fill up that first cup. So the more we pour in there, the more of those fixation sites are occupied and the more available that nutrient is. So it's just, I don't know, I like to think about things in common sense ways, and to me that made sense. So take it or leave it. Hopefully that works. Then we want to consider our environmental conditions, and this is where we're getting closer and closer to talking about starters. But warm soils. In our warm soils, roots are rapidly growing and they're exploring new soil. When they're exploring new soil, they're getting into new areas with higher nutrient concentrations. They're able to access that and take it up. And our nutrient diffusion rates are higher. Warmer is better for nutrient uptake. Cool soils, roots aren't growing as fast, and then also working against you, the cooler soils, diffusion rates are lower. So you have less root growth and slower diffusion rates. Dry soil is kind of analogous to the warm soil. It's warmer. If it's warmer, we also have higher biological activity. In the wet soil, we think about cool soils. So poor drain soil is going to be cooler and have lower biological activity. So those are kind of the mechanisms where we start thinking about, well, is a starter going to work for me? So we're just about there. So to band or not to band, whether it be a starter or not, what am I looking for? What benefit am I looking to for this banding operation? Well, one, possibly reducing the soil fixation potential of the nutrients. So this is increasing availability of nutrients in that band. We can increase the nutrient use efficiency with certain nutrients, the mobile ones particularly, which means we can get by applying smaller rates. And if that root is just not growing that fast, we're putting it closer so that root gets to that higher concentration of nutrients sooner. However, challenges that we see from banding is potential salt burn. If you put too much, you have osmotic effects. That's water pulling, or the salt pulling water away from wherever, like the seed in this instance, and free ammonia. Ammonia is detrimental to seed germination. You can only put so much. It's either limited by your equipment or limited by what you can put without causing injury to the plant or the seed. We also have extra equipment on the planter and extra time to plant. Takes more time to fill up the tanks, more stops, more weight. All this comes into the area of challenges. So now, finally, to the topic Clint asked me to talk about. Starter fertilizers. Starter fertilizer are banded fertilizers. All the things that we talked about to this point are, applicable to starter fertilizers, whether it be a 2x2 band, 2 inches to the side and 2 inches below the seed, or a in furrow or pop up, which is, right on top or right below the seed. So this is typically, when we're talking about starter fertilizers, we're trying to get through early harsh season growing conditions, cool, wet conditions. When the plant's not growing, their diffusion rates are going to be lower because of the cool soils. We just don't have real great growth conditions for those early seeded or early planted seeds. We must be aware of these salt potentials, the fertilizer, osmotic effects. I'm sure there's several people in this group that have kids that do 4-H country hams. I have 3 kids. I get 6 country hams every year. But what they're doing when they rub that salt mixture onto that country ham is drawing the moisture away out of that ham so it cures. So if you have too much of a salt next to that seed, we can pull the water away. Same thing that goes on when you're applying anhydrous ammonia in the spring. You don't want to plant right on top of that row the next day after you inject your anhydrous. You have salt effects. It's pulling the water away. And then another thing we have working against us is urea. The degradation of urea, one of the first steps, or the first step, it goes to ammonia, NH3. And high concentrations of ammonia can also be detrimental to seed germination. So when we're doing a band, whether they're a 2x2 or a pop-up, we need to make sure we're not getting too far above that rate where we're causing these issues to be, problematic for our plant. We want to benefit our plant growth and germination or growth, not hurt it. So the general rule of thumb that's been in place since I've been here, and I have no reason to say it's wrong. I think it's a good kind of rule of thumb to go by. For 2x2 placement, whether it's a dry product or a liquid product, we need to limit our rate to 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen plus K2O. The nitrogen has a pretty high salt index, some of them, and then also the potash products. Muriate of potash has one of the highest salt indexes of any fertilizer we have. So you need to watch the N plus K2O. And then for pop-up or in furrow, which is being placed right on top of that seed, we're looking at about 15 pounds per acre. Now, again, this is a rule of thumb. If you have this is probably for a general silt loam soil, which is the majority of our surface soils in Kentucky. But if you have a heavier soil, you can probably get away with a little bit more than that. If you have a real sandy type soil, something like that, that 115 pound recommendations might be a little bit high, but that's a good ballpark figure. And then before you do anything, consider the products that are available and what are their value to your operation. And when you're thinking about that, you need to think about when you're doing it, what the soil conditions are, what you're trying to, benefit, or what your objective of using that starter is. So this is just a paper or some research done by Bender and some others back in 2013. And what they were looking at, and I'm sure many of y'all have seen this partitions out nutrient uptake by different leaf parts throughout the growing season. This was 250 bushel corn planted at 34,000 plants per acre. And I just thought, hey, 30 days, 1 month out, that's probably a pretty good place to show how little nutrients are actually taken up at that point. Now on this y-axis, the legend is, or the labels are different for each one, and they're actually in kilograms of P and kilograms per K per hectare. Well, I had to convert it over so it made sense to me. Once you convert from kilograms per hectare to pounds per acre, and then from P to P2O5, 30 days after planting, roughly only about 4 pounds of P2O5 are taken up by that corn plant. About 17 pounds of K2O and 18 pounds or so of nitrogen. So 1 month out, not a whole lot of nutrients have been taken up. So that's where we can get by with our low rates of starter fertilizers. So why do we want to consider a starter fertilizer? Well, the big thing, like I mentioned, is to overcome these early season stresses, harsh soil conditions. If we're looking at soil temperatures, I have 52 here. I've seen 50 to 55, but 52, 53. If you're somewhere above that, it's probably not much of a starter effect. It might actually be a effect of low nutrient concentration. But regardless, what we're looking at is probably the biggest benefit from what we've seen are no-till soils or poorly drained or not well-drained soils. We have these slow initial growth. We see it every year. Every year I get some calls about purple corn. That's typically phosphorus deficiency, just because soil conditions are cool. That plant is growing slow, small root growth. Yellow corn, that's going to be nitrogen, sometimes maybe sulfur mineralization. But when we get our soils to warm up, they typically start growing and taking up these nutrients. We have that small root system, and we're just trying to help the plant out by getting the fertilizer closer to the plant, so the roots don't have to grow as far to get that nutrient. And theoretically, it should grow off a little bit faster and hopefully more uniformly. A lot of times we will see a healthier appearance, earlier growth, possibly weed suppression if we get earlier growth, get that canopy closure a little bit sooner. But in my mind, the question that I would want to answer would be, what about yield? And there's been some research, several different places that shows lower grain moisture at harvest, up to 1 to 2%. Is that something that's a value? Well, it might be, depending on your production system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I came into in 2010, what the current knowledge was that had been done before I showed up. And it'd be Lloyd Murdoch, John Grove, and then I'll finish up with some current research that I've been doing. This is what Lloyd Murdoch gave me back in 2010 when I started. He summarized it all in one slide. This is in several different publications, but we have tillage in this left column. Let me see if I can get my pointer here. There we go. So we have our tillage, we have tilled, no-tilled, and no-tilled. Soil drainage, so tilled with all types of soil drainage, no-till well-drained, and no-till not well-drained. And now here's what we're interested in, the consistency of response. Well, if we have tilled soils, regardless of the drainage, they occasionally saw a yield increase, and when it is averaged over all the sites and locations and years they had, maybe a 1% yield increase. No-tilled, well-drained, sometimes. So this is going to be this should be the warmest soil. We're drying it out. We're getting the water is drying out quicker. Soil's warming up faster. This is going to be somewhere in the middle. It's well drained, but we have a mulch cover. sometimes he would see, or they would see, a response in 1 to 3 bushels. And then in no-tilled, which they say not well drained, so somewhat poorly drained or poorly drained, they saw, a pretty consistent response to starter application, and maybe 5 to 7 bushels. So that's averaged over a lot of different stuff, and that's what I went with for a long time. Then John Grove shared some data with me, and this is just an example of some of the fields that he worked in. If you look, the darker red means this is a basin. This is more the lower elevation, and as the colors get lighter, the elevation increases. This is not uncommon for a lot of the fields that we have here in Western Kentucky. A lot of the craters look this way. There might even be a sinkhole here that has fallen out, but these are typically going to be drainage areas in the field. This is the couple summary slides of the information he found. The change in yield in bushels per acre related to soil test phosphorus. So if we increase our soil test phosphorus, we either increase our yield or we decrease our yield. And it looks like a shotgun effect, but if you fit this is fitted just a regression line. What it shows is we, as soil test soil test P increases, our likelihood to a response decreases. So if you average all this data out, once we hit a soil test value of 27.5 pounds per acre, just solving this equation, our yield response was 0. But actually, you see it all over the place. There's a yield response here at 70 something, but then you see a lot of yield hits here. But on average, this data shows that if you're above 28 pounds per acre, that's not going to benefit, a starter's not going to benefit yield. Like, well, that's interesting. And then the average response of all this data was about 5 pounds. This is a no-till field that kind of agrees with that data that Murdoch had previous. What about elevation? Here's the regression analysis here. As our elevation increases, we see less likelihood for a positive response. This, I mean, it really doesn't mean anything, but at 498 feet, no positive yield was, or 152 meters. So somewhere in here, if you average it out, there is no positive yield increase. Once we got above that, we're looking at a warmer soil. Again, that's not an absolute, that's an average value. And where does the line go? Oh, well, there comes the line. This is a little bit more than the 5 pounds that they saw. This is a different field, still no-till, but still not far off of that value that Murdoch gave. And that, that work was done 20 years ago. This work here was done 20 years ago. Murdoch's was done 30 to 40 years ago. So far, it's in pretty much agreement.
Edwin, you said you used the term pounds, but you go back a slide. You're talking about bushels, just both.
I'm sorry.
But just like what you came into, it showed about a 5 bushel increase.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, 5 to 7 bushels. Thank you, Clint. So I used a lot of that data. Clint asked me to present this at the Ag Expo about 4 years ago, and I didn't have any data on my own. I pulled from Murdoch's and I pulled from Groves and some others, and Philip Anderson was the moderator of that session. And after it was over, he said, "Evelyn, I had several people tell me that's old data. Don't you guys have anything any newer?" And I'm like, "Well, no, not really." But I took that comment to heart. So I went to the Kentucky corn growers, and I asked them. I told them what was going on. I asked them for money to do this research. So we were funded in 2019 and again in 2020, and I just found out we were funded again. So we will have 3 years of data when I get finished at the end of this year. But what I wanted to look at were what environments are most likely to benefit corn starter response and if the products differ. And I was just strictly looking at a pop-up or in furrow. We were putting down rates right with the seed. In 2019, we had the new planter and had some trouble getting it going. We didn't get planted as early as we wanted to, so we only had one location and one planting date. But then in 2020, we were able to get 2 locations and then 2 planting dates. We had a frangipane soil, which would be the wetter, cooler soil. And then we had a Kreider silt loam, which is a better drained, and it should be warmer soil. And then we planted early and then late. Early being, I think, the first or second week of April, and then the first or second week of May. And we looked at plant emergence, plant height. We measured soil electrical conductivity, measure that salt in the furrow, grain moisture, and yield, looking at the yield components. So this is a little bit busy, but what we looked at, we of course had our control with no starter added. We looked at UAN, 28% nitrogen, and that per gallon had 2.97 pounds of nitrogen. So we had 2.3 pounds of N plus K2O per gallon. If you calculate that out based on our 15-pound recommended max, we can put down about 5 pounds per acre in furrow. Ammonium polyphosphate, 1034O, lower salt index, but about 1.2 pounds of N plus K2O. We could get up almost 13 pounds or gallons per acre with that product. And then we used a low salt starter, a 924-3, and it had 1.3 pounds of N plus K2O, and we could get down about 11.5 gallons per acre at a max rate. And then a mixture. This is something, this UAN plus ammonium polyphosphate, this is something several producers use, and you can get down almost 9 gallons per acre before you hit that critical value. Well, we weren't looking at maxing out the rates. We were looking at what is practical, what could be done. So we were looking at 2.5 gallons per acre and 5 gallons per acre. Those are the 2 rates we had. So here ended up being our overall treatments. Control, the UAN at 2.5 and 5 gallons, ammonium poly at 2.5 and 5 gallons, a mixture of 2.5 gallons of each, and then these low salt starters at 2.5 or 5 gallons. This is a starter, or the planter. The corn board actually built this for us and then donated it down here at Princeton for the programs here to use. We're really thankful of that, and it's been getting used. Travis plants all of his corn with this. Kirsten, I believe, plants a lot of her corn with this. We plant corn and beans with it. It's a good planter, and we're happy to have it. But we had 3 tanks with 3 different products in it, and we applied the treatments accordingly. Here is our location on Watson Road. We were back in here. If anyone's been on this farm, there's not very many houses. You don't see any houses really till you get right here, and then there's one way up here, but the rest of this is woods and crop fields and deer. So we have some deer issues back here. Just going to show you some data now. We're getting into that. Our blue line was our first plant height measurement. Our second was the orange, and then we measured it the 3rd time, and that's the gray bars. So if you have different letters, that means they're different. Really, we didn't have any significant and no great significant differences in the plant heights the first date, except for this ammonium polyphosphate was taller than to control the UAN at both rates. Okay, it's a little bit different. And then we saw kind of the same thing at the second. And we saw kind of the same thing at the third. So from here, it appears that maybe these ammonium polyphosphates or these low salt starters might be better than the control or the UAN based on plant height. Plant height doesn't always relate to yield, but that's what we have. Well, we measure our electrical conductivity. Well, our ammonium polyphosphate, it was about the same as the control that received none, and some of these low salt starters. This one here, this low rate was about the same. The UAN had higher electrical conductivities, so a higher salt load right there in the furrow where it was applied. Well, now we get into the yield components. If you look at this probability of a greater F, not to bore you with statistics, but we like this number to be below 0.1. If it's at 0.9, that means there's a 10% chance that these differences in yield, if they are truly different, is just based on a random occurrence. So we want that to be below 0.1. So this right here means there's really no difference in yield. If there are differences in yield, it's very unlikely that it was due to a treatment effect. It was just random noise. So our moisture was essentially the same across all products. Our test weight, very high. Probability of a greater F, essentially the same. And our yield, same thing, very high probability of a greater F. Now I've been, questioned on this data. Edwin, that's 159 bushels versus 183. That's 24 bushel difference. Well, that's true. However, we have a lot of random variability going in here due to that picture I showed you a few slides ago called deer. We had a lot of deer damage. It just happened that this was a little bit just variable yield data, and it really bothers me that we had that, but that's what, from a scientific standpoint, that's what it shows. Well, let's just throw that out and say, okay, I don't believe in statistics. Okay, I'm going to either pick UAN or I'm going to pick this low salt starter. Okay, just remember that going forward. So what we summarized from the 2019 research, the starter with the higher N and P had greater plant heights than N alone. So we did see a benefit from plant height with that ammonium polyphosphate or some of those starters. We had the highest electrical conductivity with the UAN. And starter really didn't influence stand counts at any date. I didn't show that data, but not much going on there. No statistical difference between any of the treatments for grain moisture, test weight, or yield. So what we concluded based on the data set we have, early growth and soil electrical conductivity values did not relate to final yield. That's the story for 2019. Well, 2020, we had the planter worked out a lot better, more timely planting. We were able to get both of our soils that we wanted, had pretty good growing conditions. We did have a lot of rain, a lot of in-loss, which will come into play here in a little bit. And we're still contending. We put up fences, but they still seem to get over that, still contending with some deer damage on that Watson Road location. So here is our emergence. Remember this probability of a greater F, 0.95, 0.4, 0.2. Really, there's no difference in emergence with any of these plant dates with any of the products. So whether you use a product or not, we're going to get the same emergence. And I'm sorry, this was planted April 10th. This is the early planting on Watson Road. This is the same thing. What about plant height? Well, we did see a statistical difference here. Pretty much most of the products, or the UAN and the low salt, were taller than the check, 1.5 inches taller at 2 weeks. Is that a big deal or not? Well, it didn't happen before, it didn't happen after. Well, maybe that was just an anomaly, maybe that's real, but we'll address that here in a minute. What about our electrical conductivities? Well, again, very high probability of a greater F, which means very low likelihood to be really truly treatment differences. And even if they are, we're looking to see values somewhere around 4, not 0.4, before we start hurting our germination. So real low levels of salt here. Well, here's the $100 question. What about our yield and yield components? Plant moisture didn't differ, test weight didn't differ, and actually yield did not differ. So if you remember before, I said, okay, let's say it doesn't matter. What are we going to use? Okay, it would have been the UAN or the low salt starter. Now this year, okay, well, maybe one of the UAN, but these low salt starter. These are just random occurrences, if that makes sense. That's why we do statistics. That's why we replicate these trials in different years in different locations to see if we get the same results more than once. If you remember, that ammonium polyphosphate was one of the lowest yielding last year or the previous year, one of the highest this year. So they're really not different. This is the Kevel track. This is a track across. Here's where we've been for years and years. Just acquired this in the past few years, and I was up here on this section of soil for the second location. We have houses, not deer. This was a good thing, or very low deer pressure. Looking at the same thing on this early planting date, no difference in emergence really until this third one, and I don't think this is really a big deal. What happened? We had a drop off in germination or emergence with this in the third, and just lost a plant or two between counts. So really not a big deal. 29 versus 26, and it was 29 versus 27 previously. What about plant height? Again, they're all about the same. High probability of a greater F, all essentially about the same. So we didn't see any differences in plant height regardless of the treatment. What about electrical conductivity? Not really anything going on here either. It's all essentially the same. Well, what about these yield and yield components? Nothing going on here with the moisture. All within a pound or a percentage of each other. Not enough consistency to say they were statistically different. Saw a little bit of a difference here. This ammonium polyphosphate had a little bit higher than everything else. I wouldn't get too hung up on that. In our yield, it went from 194 to 206. Again, it's varying. It varies. Well, now we're looking at our emergence from the second planting on the Kevel. We just absolutely, the deer ate us up on the second planting of the Watson, even with our fence. And we've learned how to build fences better now. But anyway, this is the second planting date, May 7th for Kevel. Nothing going on with emergence. We did see a slight difference in height at the second planting or the second count. They were all essentially 2 inches greater than the check, and then nothing at the third. EC, we did see a little bit of a difference with the EC. All the products except for these low salt or this low salt was slightly lower or slightly lower than the check. And then pretty much the same thing going on here. Just these UANs, which we'd expect to have a little bit higher salt content just due to the product itself. However, that third one, there's no differences in our electrical conductivity. Our yield components, no difference in moisture, no difference in test weight, and our yield. Someone said, hey, Edwin, are you talking about soybean now? We applied our nitrogen at the same time. We applied it up front in that whole field. We thought, oh, we'll be back in 2 weeks. It's not going to rain 12 inches. We're not going to lose all of our nitrogen. So possibly one of the biggest take-home messages from this data set is, and this was a well-drained crider, is a month out might be a little bit too early to apply your nitrogen if you get 1.5 feet of rain. So we didn't see any yield differences, but we lost pretty much all of our nitrogen here. So just wrapping it up, we really didn't have any consistent starter benefit for any plant date or location. We did see a little bit of plant heights, but really it didn't relate back to yield. We saw some differences in electrical conductivity, but it didn't really relate back to yield. So what we determined from these 2 years of research, right now we haven't had the correct environment where we're actually going to see a benefit in yield. So my data actually does differ a little bit from Lloyd Murdoch's and John Groves, is where I haven't truly seen a benefit. They have seen a little bit of one in certain conditions. So to wrap it up, do I use a starter or not? Consider which nutrients being addressed. Probably don't need a potassium source in your starter. It's going to either be a nitrogen or phosphorus response. Which crop is being considered? I said soybeans a little bit more tolerant to assault than the corn is, but we're planting our soybeans typically a little bit later, and the soil is warmer. And that's what in cotton. I received my master's at UT Knoxville, and I did my work at UT Jackson in cotton. And one of the practices they were looking at then was the hill to bed cotton, and they'd plant into the top of that bed. And all they were doing is getting the soil temperature to raise, and it was a starter effect. They would see a little bit earlier germination, maybe a little bit better growth early on, and then sometimes a little bit of a yield benefit. So consider your crop. What are the environmental conditions present? I'm going to go back to that research that Murdoch and Grove have done. Probably going to see a bigger chance of a response in the cool, damp soils versus the warm, dry. And then what is the probable benefit? What is the likelihood I'm going to see a starter? And does that benefit offset the cost of the starter? And when we're talking about cost, not only the product, but the amount of time it takes to fill up your tanks, the amount of steel or whatever you need to do to get that starter down. So that is what I have for today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. Thank you, Clint, and thank you all for hanging in there.
Thanks, Edwin. I don't see anything in the chat. Anybody
I
needs
do have a
to
question.
unmute? Yes, John.
So I understand your statistics where you're saying you didn't see a statistical difference in each trial, but you showed at least 4 trials, and in every single one of them, UAN was higher than the check. So I'm puzzled by how that's not showing up somewhere in your statistical analysis is better.
I analyzed this by individual site. I thought when we get done, we're going to group across all and do it that way. Right now, the way we sliced it, it just hasn't shown up. I don't think, and I don't have it. I mean, I could probably run it here in the next 30 minutes or so, but I don't think it's going to shake out. But that is something we will do for sure.
Well, I mean, empirically, if you look at it, I mean, 5 bushel running on 4 separate locations, trials, etc. I mean, that would seem to have the potential to be real.
It might, and I appreciate you bringing. There's the same there. We will look at that for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that would echo what Lloyd and Dr. Grove had. I mean, historically, I think the 5 bushels probably pretty solid, even if it didn't shake out in these specific trials. Well, statistically shake out, the measured yield did indicate that. Are you planning on, you said you're funded for 2021 on this same trial?
We received notification at the end of December that we got funding again. So we're going to go back to the same area on the Watson Road and somewhere across on the Kevel property and do that again. So we'll have similar environmental conditions. Hopefully we can get early planning in and a later planning in as well.
So might I suggest a trial with the UAN at something closer to 10 gallon?
I thought about that. What I was trying to do, I had limited area to put it in when I started the first year. And that's why I kept those treatments. I weighed several things, and one of the things is what space I had to work in, and that's how it worked out. And to do what you're saying as far as which I want to do, and I planned on doing, running these statistics across years and locations, I don't need to be messing with the treatments too much. And I don't know that I have the area back there. It's there. When we start getting out of certain areas, we get into bad areas in the field. I mean, if I might be able to do that. So you're saying run a 10 gallon per acre UAN and nothing else?
Possibly. I mean, we run about 7, and it seems to show up a little better than 4 or 5.
Yeah.
At least visually. Now, I don't have good data on the yield effect.
Okay. I appreciate it. We'll see what we can do.
Edwin, a chat comment came in about the soil pH making a difference. Have you noticed anything about or what the soil pH was in your trials, or anything about those nutrients?
You were breaking up at the beginning. You said the soil pH?
Yes.
Soil pH, I have that data. The lowest was about 6.1. I think the highest was about 6.4. So we were in that area. We weren't really concerned with pH at all. When you do get to higher pH values, you can see a little bit more potential issues with ammonia. Especially if you're using a DAP in furrow, but we weren't using the DAP in furrow, possibly with the UAN, but you have to be above a pH 7 really before you see anything going on there. And we don't think that there was any issues at all with the soil pH.
Okay. Well, thanks, Edwin. That's good presentation. And again, that's a topic I think is just going to continue to increase. Got another chat message come in. Can you read that, Edwin? Were your plots in furrow or 2x2, Edwin?
They were in furrow. They were right on the seed.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Edwin. Thank